Check.
What's up everybody, my name is AAA and welcome to Game Off, the series that has about 8 different scoring systems that change every single episode. But not today. Nope, I think we found the best and most reliable scoring system after a couple weeks of doing this. And although if my fan base grows, I do want to adjust it in order to get you guys involved, that group isn't quite big enough yet. So aside from that, let's just set a record for the least amount of time spent on a Game Off introduction by quickly recapping the scoring system. Like I said in my Mass Effect 2 video, the single game branch of this series will be scored as follows. 25 points will be awarded for Metacritic and user scores. I'll average those two scores out and then divide them by 4 in order to get something out of 25. If the critic and user scores are very different, probably any time it's greater than a 10-point difference, like Breath of the Wild, this section is void and I just multiply the score out of the remaining 75 points by 4 out of 3 in order to get a score out of 100. Those 75 points will be determined by me, with 20 allocated for story, 15 of those being for actual plot and 5 being for characters and interactions, then 5 points for voice acting, a whopping 25 for gameplay, which is evenly split for gameplay mechanics and how well they work as an actual fun factor of the game. The next 5 points are for visuals, art, and music, all of those combined. Innovation is worth 10 points, and finally identity, which is what the game does that sets it apart from others. It's non-conventional stuff that can't fit it into any other category because it's very unique, or perhaps it's just a benchmark for one of our previous categories. All that fun stuff is worth another 10 points. Our current standings are as follows. The Last of Us leads the pack with a score of 94.375, followed by Mass Effect 2 with a 92.75, as well as Shadow of the Colossus at 92.39, and Breath of the Wild holding last place right now at a 92. If you're wondering why Breath of the Wild is so low, I mentioned it in my Mass Effect video if you want to check that out. Sorry it's not in the actual Breath of the Wild episode, that was just way back when the scoring system didn't really exist, so sorry. Anyways, that took up less than half a page of script. Hell yes, this is starting things off right. Alright, let's see if we can zip through the Metacritic scores too. Red Dead Redemption has both an Xbox 360 and a PS3 review on Metacritic, but unlike Mass Effect 2, which had some fluctuations here, the only difference here is 1 point for the user score. The user scores are also close enough to the critic scores, which means all we have to do is really average this bad boy out, and in doing so we get a 92.25, which when divided by 4 gives us a total Metacritic score of 23.0625 out of 25, which is our second highest Metacritic score to date, behind only The Last of Us, which is a pretty great start on all accounts. Our next category here is story, and in this here Western world, our story follows Mr. John Marston as he attempts to capture or kill his fellow gang members in order to redeem himself. Why is this done, you ask? Well, okay, screw this accent, that got really annoying really fast. This is done because the Federal Bureau has threatened both John Marston and his family, and the only way to save his family is to do their dirty work. This isn't the only storyline throughout, there are a whole ton of subplots and interesting characters met along the way. As with most open world titles, most of the gravity of the story is in the smaller focused story moments than the actual overarching plot as a whole. Still, the story does have an interesting concept, and without spoiling the ending, it's handled very well and there are plenty of twists, and the ending is very shocking and well crafted. That part especially is certainly unique among video games. A lot of people see Red Dead Redemption as simply the Western GTA, and while in some cases that might be kinda true, with eerily similar gunplay and the same basic open world formula, the story differences is one of the biggest things that set these two games apart. Although to be fair, they are both about criminals and how a federal bureau uses them, so I mean, I guess it's not entirely unique, but still. Personally, I think it takes a unique angle at storytelling and setting the scene as well. Not to mention the Western genre is often ignored, especially by big developers, so it's cool that Rockstar is tapping into this fairly untouched reservoir of gaming. I think the base of the storyline is interesting and engaging, and all the characters bring up some cool plot points and ongoing storylines. But my one problem with some open world games is how thinly their stories are spread, and doesn't leave you with the same impact. It's a sacrifice that is made for longer sections of gameplay and extending the story to make the game last longer in general, so I can't really be too harsh on the pacing and the thinly spread nature of the games, since it's kind of done on purpose, but when it gets to the point where I'm no longer truly interested, I do need to take away some points. Again, it's a good story and John's own backstory is really interesting, but my meter for how much I like a game's story and how truly interested I am is very sensitive, so when a game has a good story but it doesn't click with me on all cylinders, I know it's missing something, however small it may be, and I think here it's the thinly spread nature. This was a detriment to GTA also, and I mentioned it briefly in my Game Off for that franchise, but since the fourth entry of that series helped out a bit by being more tightly woven and a truly story-driven game, it kinda got away with that a little bit. But since this is unfortunately a single game and not a complete franchise, it doesn't really have that luxury. This isn't Fallout 4 where you pretty much forget your main purpose because it's only really brought up at the beginning and end of the game, but I think it takes a good hit and a half here. 13.5 out of 15 for actual plot, but the characters are easily a 5. They're very colorful and diverse and bring all these different flavors and interactions and storylines, and actually manage to hold your interest when you're on those really long horse rides into another location. That means overall for the story, this game earns a fantastic 18.5 out of 20. Moving on to voice acting, which is only worth 5 points, but if you've watched other episodes, you know that 5 points make a big difference. Most of the voice acting is really good, and you get voice actors who really sell the Western feel. Their voices are gritty and their accents are great, but some smaller characters have some pretty cringe-inducing exchanges that feel incredibly out of place here. It's pretty jarring, and while on the most part most of the main characters have great voice acting, some of the less developed or not as recurring characters do have some bad impact here. I spent a lot of time thinking of what I wanted to give it here. 4.5 seemed like it was too high due to the frequency of some of this bad voice acting, and 4 seemed a little harsh, so screw it, I'm going with 4.25. What, the numbers always get messy in the end anyways, I might as well start giving out quarter points here. Next up we have gameplay, and this is not only in general the biggest category of them all, but as an open world title, a Rockstar game, and a game that is supposed to be sold more on gameplay than its story, and even sacrifices a more tightly woven story for gameplay purposes, this is definitely something Red Dead Redemption has to nail in order to compete with our top competitors. The 25 points are split evenly in two, with 12.5 points for mechanics and 12.5 points for fun factor. Let's take a look at the former first. Mechanically, this game is very similar to GTA. The third-person shooting looks and to some extent feels the exact same, although you do get some different weapons here, and Marston's slow-mo shooting ability is something that greatly resembles some of the abilities of our GTA 5 characters. The shooting is fun and the guns have a nice feel to them, and so combat-wise, I think this game has no real flaws mechanically. It might not be the single most groundbreaking thing in the entire universe, but it's solid. A couple small things outside the combat could use a little bit of work though. I feel like the store and the stuff you could buy there was a little underwhelming, and I never really had the urge to ever use something from there. The AI also isn't incredibly fantastic, and the horses can be very frustrating to use, which is unfortunate considering they're used frequently and oftentimes for very, very long periods of time. It's not completely world-breaking and shitty controls, but there's a bit to be desired here. Overall, while it's mostly sound, I'm gonna have to take away a point because if I combine all of these smaller missteps, although they're not the single most important thing in the game, it's definitely stuff that isn't new and we've seen it be done better before this. And so it just seems like this game is lacking some things. In terms of fun factor, again, for the most part this game is great. Your ability never gets old and the third-person shooting is proven to be very entertaining considering its popularity in both this game and GTA, and again, combat is pretty great here. It's instead some of the smaller stuff that puts a damper on things. Once again, riding around in your horse is done often both for story and non-story reasons, and while it's not too bad to go from place to place like this, at some point it just loses most of its enjoyability. GTA also had some more low-key driving moments where you just follow the path and it was a simple route, so there wasn't much crazy twists and turns to be had here, and although both games fill those moments with dialogue, the actual action of it can get kind of boring in Red Dead Redemption. GTA's driving is simply better and more fun at its core, so those driving scenes can seem a little bit less dull. But Red Dead can just seem a little bit more like a chore sometimes that really puts me out of the game. Fast travel does exist, but most of the time you're getting around with your horse, and it can be a bit much at times. Also, some side missions can be pretty boring and focus on wildlife, and those are usually good ways to improve John's abilities, so I wish they'd been a bit more interesting. Also, playing the good moral version of John can be a little bit bland at times. Once again, these are smaller parts of the gameplay, but they still lower the fun factor of the game because they're not entirely just background things. So again, in this category, Red Dead Redemption earns an 11.5 out of 12.5, leaving it with a gameplay score of 23 out of 25. Continuing along, we get visuals, art, and music. And while in terms of art style, with this being a Western game and a realistic looking simulation of that Western theme, this game doesn't have as much freedom to play around with its art as some of our previous competitors like Shadow of the Colossus and Breath of the Wild. But with what it had, it did not disappoint in any way. The game was incredibly realistic with amazing textures, extremely realistic looking environments, and an engrossing setting. When I do these episodes, I always look at both supporters and haters of the game, so I can try and see some other opinions when I'm making these videos. And I ran across an IGN article on why Red Dead Redemption was bad. And in it, the guy bashes Red Dead Redemption for a lot of small things that I mentioned. And he's pretty harsh on those things and a couple more. But the one thing he couldn't deny were the visuals and effects, claiming they created a visceral experience and was the only real reason to play the game. So while it might not have had the artistic freedom that some of our other games have, it hit the nail on the head with everything it tried to do, and in my opinion earns a perfect 5 out of 5. Moving on to innovation, and while I really wish it had innovated a little bit more combat-wise, a lot of the stuff besides that had some really forward thinking. The setting itself is new and could honestly become a whole proper genre, just like it actually is in movies, but it isn't really heavily explored in gaming, and that just gives it major points in this category. Some of the dynamics and storytelling mechanics are really interesting too. There's a lot that this game has to offer. And yet you also have the exact same type of third-person shooting combat that looks identical to GTA except with a western coat of paint, and it follows most of the conventional open world staples that have already been seen before. It really comes down to how harsh I want to be. The unique setting and the storytelling and a couple of other factors put it upwards of 7 points in my opinion, but its reliance on already proven formulas, even outside of its own development team, and the fact that their main combat and their structure follows those already made staples, I don't think it can be a 10 here. So I really need to decide whether it's an 8 or a 9, and this is really important seeing as a 1 point difference can literally be your ticket from 5th place to 2nd place, and as the standings are currently, this is a tough decision. And this being an important decision, I did try to convince myself one way or another, but I just couldn't figure out which one to choose, so I decided to just split it down the middle. There's so much going on for this game innovation-wise, but there's also some really old tricks, albeit proven ones. The truth is, while you can easily tell Rockstar's two big franchises apart due to their setting, characters, story, and some gameplay differences, people tag this as the Western GTA for a reason. And while I think it separates itself well, I can definitely see where those people are coming from. An 8.5 in my opinion is the best representation of what it does in terms of innovation and perfecting formulas. Finally, we have identity, and again, while you can see the GTA influences, this is where that matters a little bit less, and it's all about just plain uniqueness. Not only is there interesting and intuitive multiplayer, there's also a unique game setting here, as well as all the main voice acting and visuals sell the world. On top of that, you have an amazing and unique ending that opens this up to so many options for its sequel, and the fun slow motion mechanic which is seen in other games, but is very iconic to this one. And I think I can pretty easily give it full marks here. While our innovation section was hurt by the fact that the game was stagnant in many big areas, the reason that it still got a good score there was because of a plethora of uniqueness that it owned as well. And in this category, we just ignore the conventional stuff and simply focus on those unique qualities, which is why I'm being a bit more generous here. Okay, so what score does that leave us with? Well, if the game had managed a 9 out of 10 in that innovation category, it would have just barely snagged 2nd place by 0.05 points. But as it stands instead, it lands at our 4th spot above only Breath of the Wild at 92.3125 points. Again, the smallest shift in points could have changed the rank drastically, but I think 4th place suits it well. I know lots of people absolutely adore this game, and in such a competitive and in-depth review, let me just say that a 92.3 is still incredible. But the game sometimes tries to bite off more than it can chew in my opinion, and some slightly smaller things can feel half-baked. Those small things might have been a bit more forgivable in a linear game that only happens once or twice, but with the style of game this is, those small things happen so often that it starts sticking out like a sore thumb. So while the game has a lot of great attributes, it stops short by some of those recurring missteps that really draw attention to themselves. Who knows though, the sequel is coming up and might even top this incredible score, so we'll have to wait to find out. That wraps up today's episode of Game Off, guys. Hope you enjoyed, and be sure to leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you all in the next video.